Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies as we continue with part 7 of the History of the Jesuits by G.B. Nicolini. Chapter 6, 1548 through 1556. The first opposition to the order and death of Loyola. The order of Jesuits, which had hitherto progressed so favorably, was now surrounded with difficulties and enemies, while the rapid increase of the society, the influence it had acquired, and the wealth which it had already accumulated, combined to render the Jesuits less cautious and more authoritative. They caused also a great deal of envy, especially among those classes menaced by the company and some of their privileges. At the first opportunity, an attempt was made to crush the order in the bud. This opportunity was offered by the Emperor Charles V, who had at no time been very favorable to the institution and who, no matter how bigoted a Catholic he may have become in his latter days, was then just as much Catholic as was necessary to extend his dominions and to consolidate his despotic power. In 1548, Charles, indigent at the cunning policy of Paul III, who sent the emperor to war with the reformers and who deserted him when he feared that, being master of the Protestant League, he would also become his dictator. Charles, we say, when the Pope recalled his troops, not wishing to drive the Protestant princes to extremities, published the famous Interim, a sort of compromise between the two creeds, and a tacit acquiescence in the more commonly received doctrines of the reformers, leaving, besides, in their hands, the confiscated ecclesiastical properties. Paul became furious at the audacity of a layman mingling in matters of faith, and loudly exclaimed against the prince. Cardinal Francesi, the Pope's legate and nephew, told the emperor that his book contained at least 10 propositions which were heretical, and 4 which he might be called to account. Besides his legate, the Pope had in Germany a staunch and faithful partisan in the person of Bobadilla. Bobadilla was a bold and thorough Jesuit. He went to the war as a sort of commissary to the troops which the Pope's grandson had led into Germany. At the Battle of Mulberg, he received a wound, but this gave him little concern. Some days afterwards, he was seen to be at Passau, a Protestant town, preaching the Catholic tenets and announcing a day of thanksgiving for the victory that the Catholics had gained over the Protestants. You may well believe that such a man would not hesitate to attack the Interim. In fact, by writing, by preaching publicly and privately, Bobadilla boldly denounced the book, and that even in the presence of the emperor himself, as a sacrilegious composition. The emperor, frustrating the Jesuits' desire to gain renown by means of persecution, simply expelled him from the estates. Bobadilla hastened to Rome to receive, he hoped, the deserved ovation. But alas, how bitterly was he deceived. Ignatius, fearing that Bobadilla, in impugning the Interim, may have gone beyond due bounds, thought it better at first not to receive him into the house. So Orlandini, or our Mr. Critinito, who generally transcribes literally, here with more zeal than prudence, thus reports the passage of the Jesuit writer. Loyola seized hold of this circumstance to revenge the majesty of kings, which, even in the height of the dispute, one ought never to attain. We understand you well, Mr. Critinito. You have lost much of your influence over the people, too well educated to repose much faith, either in your sanctity or your miracles, and you intend to preserve some of your domineering influence by clinging to those same kings against whom, when they were adverse to you, you directed the poniard of the assassin. Bobadilla's expulsion seemed to have been the signal for the outburst of a violent war against the order, especially in Spain. The fight began at Salamanca. 3 Jesuits, Sanji, Capella, and Turian, arrived there in 1548 for the purpose of establishing their society, They entered the town in the most pitiful condition and were so poor that, having no image to adorn the altar of their private chapel with, they instead put a piece of paper upon which was delineated, I do not know what figure, Impressam Nessico, says Orlandini. And the above Cretinino thus translates it. In consequence of having no picture, one of them simply sketched on a piece of paper an image of the Virgin, and this paper, struck on the wall, was the only ornament of the high altar. I must say I feel surprised at their candor. You confess, then, that you worship a dirty scrap of paper upon which you do not know what sort of figure was represented, or you scratch 4 lines and make it the object of your cultus, the indispensable ornament of your altar, upon which you are going to renew the sacrifice of the cross. Ah, we already knew that your religion only consisted in externalities, in blind and absurd superstitions. Yet we register this other example to prove your own idolatry and your constant practice to represent Christ the Lord in the background, while adoring images and statues which you have made according to your heart's wishes, as our great poet says, of gold and silver. However, there lived at that time at Salamanca a Dominican friar, famous for his eloquence, his learning, and particularly for his uprightness of purpose, Melchior Cano. He had known Loyola and formed a bad opinion of him, because he never ceased speaking of his revelations, his visions, his virtues, his undeserved persecutions. After his disciples came to Salamanca, equipped only with their bigoted fanaticism and of doubtful morality, he resolved to oppose them, and poured forth against them, from his chair and pulpit, torrents of elegant invectives. He represented them as crafty, insinuating, living in palaces, deceiving the kings and the great, declaring them to be sold by every species of crime, capable of all kinds of excesses, and dangerous both to religion and society. We may perhaps say that the picture which he, in his passionate eloquence, drew of the members of the order, which he also called the pioneers of Antichrist, was somewhat exaggerated. The Jesuits at that time were not so perverse as he represented them to be, for they had, as yet, only existed for a few years. But it would seem that Cano had spoken in the spirit of prophecy of the character which it assumed in after generations, the germ of which he may have seen beginning to develop itself. If the letter which we are about to transcribe, written by him in 1560, 2 days before his death, is not to be numbered among the prophecies, it is nevertheless an extraordinary prediction which came to be fulfilled in every point. Here is this remarkable letter. God grant that it may not happen to me, as is fabled of Cassandra, whose predictions were not believed till Troy was captured and burned. If the members of the society continue as they have begun, God grant that the time may not come when kings will wish to resist them, but will not have the means of doing so. But we have anticipated. The hideous colors in which he portrayed the disciples of Loyola made such an impression in Salamanca that the Jesuits were not allowed to establish themselves in it. In vain did the Pope, taking up the cause of the Jesuits, by a bull reprove the conduct of Cano. In vain did the general of the Dominicans issue a secular to all his subordinates, in which, after a long eulogium on the society, he says that it ought to be praised and imitated, and not assailed with calamities. Cano, disregarding both the papal brief and his general's secular, and being supported, at least secretly, by the civil authorities, boldly held out against the order. What could his adversaries do? Persecution and revenge were impossible against a subject of the emperor, who was then at war with the Pope, and yet Cano must be got rid of. Well, one fine morning, he was strangely and surprised with the news that that same pope who had threatened and censured had now conferred upon him the bishopric of the Canaries. Dazzled and flattered, the friar yielded at first to the temptation and left Salamanca for his bishopric. But soon, very soon, he perceived why he had been sent so far away. Resolved, therefore, to baffle his enemy's cunning, he resigned the episcopal dignity and returned to Salamanca, the undoubted and indefatigable adversary of the order. He died provincial of his order and much respected. About the same epoch, 1548, the University of Alcalá also declared against the order. The contest lasted for a considerable time, and even after many of the doctors were, by the usual mystic arts, gained over to the cause of the company, Dr. Scala persisted in his opposition and did not refrain from attacking them till he was called before the Inquisition and threatened with an auto de fe. The opposition which the Jesuits encountered in Toledo, where they had already established themselves, was a more serious affair. They had found here the population docile and easy to impose upon. They had introduced sundry abuses and many superstitious practices. Nay, their devotees, horrid to say, went to the communion table twice a day. In the year 1550, these scandalous enormities forced themselves upon the attention of the authorities. Don Silicio, Cardinal Archbishop of Toledo, once tutor to Philip of Spain, wishing to repress them, published an ordinance reproving and condemning them, and in which, after bitterly reproaching the Jesuits for their many usurpations, he forbids the people, under pain of excommunication, to confess to any Jesuit, and empowers all curates to exclude them from the admission of all sacraments. Furthermore, laying an interdict upon the Jesuit College of Alcalá. This ordinance produced a great excitement among the Jesuits and their partisans, and nothing was left untried to make the Archbishop relent. But neither the influence that the society already possessed, nor the intercession of the Papal Nuncio and the Archbishop of Burgos, nor even the Pope's own authority, could vanquish the Archbishop's hostility. Then the bold Loyola had the imprudence to institute a process against the Archbishop before the Royal Council of Spain. Paul III was dead and was succeeded by Julius III, who was on the best terms with Charles. The Royal Council condemned the prelate, who thereupon recalled the interdict. Not that his opinions were changed, but to avoid, perhaps, the fate which encountered his successor, the learned but unfortunate Carranza. 12 years of torture in the dungeons of the Inquisition. Author's note: as this author generally quotes Orlandini and the other Jesuitical writers verbatim, we shall refer our readers to him, as it can much more easily be procured, and we shall only quote from the original when the translation is inaccurate. A still fiercer tempest was gathering over the heads of the Jesuits. At Saragossa, instructive is the cause of the quarrel. The town of Saragossa was so full of convents and monasteries that, to observe the rule which forbade any religious house to be built within a certain distance of another, it was impossible for the Jesuits to find a spot unforbidden. However, after thoroughly surveying the town, they imagined they found a spot at the requisite distance. They there erect a house and a chapel, which is to be consecrated on Easter Tuesday, 1555. Great preparations are made to make the pageant pompous and attractive, when alas, Lopez Marcos, Vicar General of Saragossa, on the complaint of the Augustine friars, who pretended that the chapel was built on their grounds, intimated to Father Brahma, the superior of the house, that the ceremony might be deferred. Brahma refused to obey, Lopez, at the very moment the Jesuits were performing the solemn ceremony, issued a proclamation forbidding the chapel to be entered under pain of excommunication. Anathemas were poured upon the fathers, and the clergy, accompanied by a great crowd of people, marched through the town, singing the 109th Psalm, the people repeating, "As he clothed himself with cursing, like as with his garment, so let it come into his bowels like water, and like oil into his bones." And, to unite the ludicrous with the terrible, they carry along images with hideous faces, representing the Jesuits dragged to hell by a legion of demons still more hideous. A funeral procession with the image of Christ covered with a black veil, singing lugubrious songs, marched towards the house of the Jesuits. From time to time, the cry, "Mercy, mercy," burst from the crowd as they wished to avert the curse of God from an interdicted city. The poor Jesuits, shut up in their own house, patiently wait for a fortnight until the tempest should pass away. But this ignoble goblin representation, worthy only of Jesuits and of their opponents, not yet ending, Loyola's disciples, as usual, gave way, feeling assured that, if actual force would be of no avail in making good their claim, intrigues and cunning would in the end win the day, nor were they deceived. In Portugal, dangers of another kind menaced the society. It seemed as if Portugal were to be the theater where the Jesuits were to perform the principal act of their ignoble drama. The protection of John III, united with the zeal of Rodriguez, had made this country one of the most flourishing provinces of the society, but its very prosperity nearly caused its ruin. Having possessed themselves of immense wealth, the Jesuits, yielding to the common law, relaxed in the strictness of their conduct, pursued a life of pleasure and debauchery. Above all, their principal college, Coimbra, resembled more of a garden of academics than a cloister. Scandal became so great that the court began to frown upon them, and the people were losing that respect and veneration with which they had before regarding them. Ignatius, of course, was soon informed of the state of things and took at once the most energetic measures for repressing the evil. In 1552, Rodriguez was recalled and sent to Spain, and a new provincial and rector were sent to Coimbra. Miron, the provincial, attempted a reform, but the Jesuits, spoiled children, refused to submit to it. Some he dismissed from the college, a greater number abandoned it. Insubordination and disorder were at their height. Fortunately, Ignatius had in the rector, Godin, a man according to his heart. Godin proved a worthy disciple of the author of the spiritual exercises. Stripping his shoulders of their garments, arming himself with a scourge, he rushed, demoniac-like, out into the streets of Coimbra and flagellated himself, crying for mercy. Breathless, covered with dust and blood, running and screaming, he returned to the college church, where the brethren were assembled, and here he again lashed himself. Strange and uncommon examples fire the imagination and prejudices of the imitators. The Jesuits were at first surprised, then, all of a sudden, they begged to be allowed to undergo the same public penance. Godin feigns to refuse. He speaks of the scandal given. He paints in strange colors the enormities of their sin, and dwells at length upon the sufferings and passion of Christ. When he had wrought their feelings to the highest pitch, he granted them the permission solicited, and, like a crowd of bacchanti, when their deity rages with them, they all rush out of the church, and with lamentable cries run through the streets, scourging themselves in a most merciless manner. When they reached the church of the Misericordia, they knelt down, whilst the rector begged pardon of the multitude for the scandal they had given. Some of the people were moved, others laughed out loud, but the intent of the rector is obtained. The disciples become more tractable. The college submits to the necessary reform, and the Jesuits regain their influence. The society met with a more serious and durable opposition in France. After their first banishment, they had returned to Paris, but there they had no house of their own. Neither could they find any. They therefore took up their abode in the College des Lombards, till Duprat, Bishop of Clermont, offered them his hotel, to which they immediately repaired. As yet, however, this establishment was neither a house for professed members, since there were none of them, nor a novitiate, since the rules for the novitiate were not yet established till 6 or 7 years afterwards. The members who repaired to the Clermont Hotel were only students or priests aspiring to become members of the society, but we are told that they were so conspicuous for their learning and piety that 3 of them were chosen by Ignatius to establish a new college in Sicily, while Loyola, the chief of those aspirants, was named by the university procurator of the College des Lombards. This nomination, however, appeared to Ignatius to be of a rather doubtful character, since it proceeded from the university, which had been adverse to the order from the first. It seemed as if he feared that these students, seduced by the allurements of honor and emoluments, would renounce their pious determination to become Jesuits. He therefore ordered Loyola to give up the appointment and to take the vows of the order before Duprat, enjoining at the same time that all students who may receive any pension from the College des Lombards should instantly renounce it. Although these orders were absolute, they were promptly obeyed. The great secret of Loyola's influence and power lay in the inflexibility of his character and in his military education, which rendered him absolute and imperative, and excluded the possibility of others disputing his orders. Meanwhile, the society in France, we should say in Paris, the only place where it had tried to establish itself, lived in a most precarious state until the year 1550, when Henry II, stimulated by the too famous Cardinal Guise, thought of establishing the Jesuits in his kingdom and issued patent letters authorizing them to do so. The ordinances of the French king were not at this time considered binding until they were registered by the Parliament. Author's note: our readers must not take the word Parliament in the same signification it has in England. The Parliament of France was composed of a body of magistrates and formed the Supreme Court of Judicature, in which the princes of the blood had a seat, and which was sometimes presided over by the king. Every province had its parliament, but none exercised the same influence with that of Paris. When those concerning the Jesuits were brought before them, the Parliament, after hearing the conclusions of their Advocate General, refused to register them on the grounds that the new institution would be prejudicial to the monarchy, the state, and the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The contest lasted for 2 years, when the king, in 1552, sent an order to the Parliament to register the patent letters of 1550, authorizing the establishment of the Jesuits. The order was formal and imperative, yet the Parliament refused to comply with it, although, out of deference to the sovereign will, they advised that further inquiries be made concerning the society. After other 2 years of serious consideration and strict inquiry, the Parliament in 1554 enacted that the bull establishing the society and the king's patent letters shall be communicated both to the Archbishop of Paris and to the Faculty of Theology there, in order that, their opinion heard, the court may come to a sentence. The Archbishop and the faculty were thus called to decide upon a question of their exclusive competence, since the one was the ecclesiastical superior and the other the natural judge in matters of faith. Both took the case in hand, and after due consideration, they respectfully decided against the establishment of the society. The Archbishop Eustache de Bellay belonging to one of the most illustrious parliamentary families of France, after mature deliberation, gave out all the reasons why he thought it was his duty to oppose the introduction of the order, and concluded in this remarkable and logical way. Since the order pretends to be established for the purpose of preaching to the Turks and infidels to bring them to the knowledge of God, they ought to establish their houses and societies in places near the said infidels, as in the times of old had been done by the Knights of Rhodes, who were placed on the frontiers of Christendom, not in the midst thereof. But the severe and bitter censure of the doctors of Sorbonne was a more explicit condemnation of the order. Here is the document of their famous conclusion. As all the faithful, and principally the theologians, ought to be ready to render an account to those who demand the same, respecting matters of faith, morals, and the edification of the church, the faculty has thought that it ought to satisfy the desire, the demand, and the intention of the court. Wherefore, having perused, and many times reperused, and well comprehended all the articles of the two bulls, and after having discussed and gone to the depths of them, during several months at different times and hours, according to custom, due regard being had to the subject, the faculty has, with unanimous consent, given this judgment, which it has submitted with all manner of respect to that of the Holy See. This new society, which arrogates to itself, in particular, the unusual title of the name of Jesus, which receives with it so much freedom and without any choice all sorts of persons, however criminal, lawless, and infamous they may be, which differs in no wise from the secular priests in outward dress, in the tonsure, in the manner of saying the canonical hours in private, or in chanting in public, in the engagement to remain in the cloister and observe silence, in the choice of food and days and fasting, and the variety of rules, laws, and ceremonies which serve to distinguish the different institutions of monks. This society, to which have been granted and given so many privileges and licenses, chiefly in what concerns the administration of the sacraments of penance and the Eucharist, and this without any regard or distinction being had of places or persons, as also in the function of preaching, reading, and teaching, to the prejudice of the ordinances and the hierarchical order, as well as of the other religious orders, and even to the prejudices of princes and lords temporal, against the privileges of the universities, in fine, to the great cost of the people. This society seems to blemish the honor of the monastic state. It weakens entirely the painful, pious, and very necessary exercises of the virtues of abstinences, ceremonies, and austerity. It even gives occasion very freely to desert the religious orders. It withdraws from the obedience and submission due to the ordinance. It unjustly deprives lords, both temporal and ecclesiastical, of their rights, carries trouble into the government of both, causes many subjects of complaint amongst the people, many lawsuits, strifes, contentions, jealousies, and divers schisms and divisions. Wherefore, after having examined all these matters and several others, with much attention and care, this society appears dangerous as to the matters of faith, capable of disturbing the peace of the church, overturning the monastic order, and more adapted to break down than to build up. Here, as in the denunciations of Cano, the faculty seems to have got a glimpse of the future history of the Jesuits, since, at this epoch at least, the accusation of receiving into the society indiscriminately was not well founded. The apologists of the Jesuits have said, and were partly inclined to admit, the truth of their assertion, that as the Jesuits were then in possession of the education of youth in many parts of Europe, the university, jealous of its privilege, condemned the order of the Jesuits not as an infamous and sacrilegious community, but as a dangerous rival. They have also affirmed that the expulsion of the famous Postel had irritated the Sorbonne, of which he was a doctor, but this we believe to be a gratuitous supposition. Author's note: this Postel was a rabbin converted to Catholicism. He was very learned, a graduate of the university, and held in high esteem by Francis I and all his court. In 1515 he went to Rome to enter the Society of Jesuits. This acquisition gave great joy to the Jesuits. Postel was very kindly received and much flattered. He then went through these spiritual exercises, but this strange course of devotion affected his fervid imagination so much that his faculties became impaired. He began to propound strange doctrines, to propose new rules for the society, and, above all, would by no means obey the rules of Ignatius. Loyola, having no longer any hold upon him, dismissed him, for which act of firmness Loyola's panegyrist extols him to the skies. However, the decisions of the Parliament, Archbishop, and University were held throughout France with a shout of jubilee. The Jesuits were obligated to leave Paris, and as all the parliaments of France had echoed the resolution of that of the capital, they would be nowhere received, and, as a last and momentary refuge, they went and hid themselves in the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. The more warlike and inconsiderate members of the order would have replied to the terrible sentence of the Sorbonne, but Ignatius was too consummate a politician to yield to their imprudent desires. For open wars, the Jesuits had no predilection. When their opponents were too strong for them, their patience was, and still is, to give way, as if in submission, but then they begin a hidden and mysterious war of intrigues and machinations, that in the end they are always the victors. So acted Ignatius in this affair in France. The Jesuits contented themselves with living for some time in obscurity and complete seclusion from all society, and preparing the way for future triumph. Nor had they long to wait. Soon they were called into France to help and cheer that atrocious and cruel hecatomb, that bloody debauch of priests and kings, the Saint Bartholomew. But what is worthy of a more serious reflection is the fact that in Rome, the center of their power and glory, the Jesuits were also publicly accused as a set of heretics, dangerous and immoral persons, and the famous book of the spiritual exercises was submitted to the Inquisition. It is indeed true that this little manual got a certificate for orthodoxy, and that the priest who had traduced them before the tribunal, having to struggle alone against the society, was condemned. We don't wonder at it, as a calumniator. But how can you subtle sons of Ignatius, explain this concurrence, this accumulation of accusations and hostilities? How is it that nations, separated from one another by diversities of interest, customs, opinion, that citizens of different classes, characters, principles, interests, that all men and nations, widely separated in everything else, united only by a common tie, the Catholic religion, should exactly agree in this one thing: hatred to and abhorrence to the avowed champion of Catholicism? And remember, we don't speak of Protestant countries or Protestant opponents. All your adversaries were bigoted Catholics. There is but one way to explain this strange coincidence. We fear that from the very beginning the Jesuits, notwithstanding all their prudence, could not conceal from the eye of the observer those subtle arts, that duplicity of character, that skill in accomplishing dark and mysterious exploits, for which they were in later times opposed and at length abolished. What is still more remarkable is the fact that the greatest part of those persons who were foremost in opposing the Jesuits knew Loyola, and, if not as intimately as Carafa and Cano, at least well enough to be able to appreciate him. We shall adduce as the last, though not the least fact, militating against the order, that Carafa, a man of the most rigid Catholicism, nay, bigotry, who had nothing so near his heart as the furtherance of the Roman religion, the former friend of Loyola, both as cardinal and as pope, was constantly and firmly adverse to the order. I should like if some of the reverend fathers would explain this almost inexplicable fact. However, all these oppositions were sooner or later got rid of by Jesuitical craft, and the society in 1556, only 16 years after its commencement, counted as many as 12 provinces, 100 houses, and upwards of 1,000 members, dispersed over the whole known world. Their two most conspicuous and important establishments were the Collegio Romano and the German College. They already were in possession of many chairs and soon monopolized the right of teaching, which gave them a most overwhelming influence. We shall speak of the colleges and of their method of study, after it had received from Aquaviva, the fifth general, a further development, and nearly the same form in which it is at the present day. The Jesuits also derived great importance from their missions, to the consideration of which we shall devote the next chapter. The reason of the immense success of the Jesuits is the fact that their order was established in direct opposition to the rising Protestantism, and that both the court of Rome and those princes whose interest it was to maintain the Catholic religion and oppose that of the Reformed were very eager to introduce and uphold the society of the Jesuits into their states. Yet, even with this preponderant favorable circumstance, the society would have either succumbed under the many obstacles it encountered in its beginning, or at least would not have progressed so rapidly had it not been for Ignatius Loyola. This extraordinary man seems to have united in his own person all the qualities indispensable for succeeding in any undertaking: unbounded ambition, inflexibility of character, unwearied activity, and a thorough and profound knowledge of the human heart. With such qualities, he could hardly fail to succeed in the accomplishment of any project. Almost every writer of Loyola's life, I do not speak either of the miracle tellers or of the pamphleteers, as representing him as most sincere, fervidly devout, and pious. On this point, however, we must observe that all the historians, not excluding even the Protestant, copied from his two first biographers, Maffei and Ribadenera. We also beg to be permitted to give the humble opinion which we have formed of him, after having carefully pursued what has been said regarding him, and much more, after a dispassionate examination of the facts connected with his life. Without doubt, Ignatius, during his illness, felt disposed to change his dissipated course of life, and, as happens in every sudden reaction, he, from being a profligate free-thinking officer, went to the other extreme and became a rigid and bigoted anchorite. No penances were too severe to expiate his numerous sins, and no devotion was too fervent to atone for his past irreligion. So he thought at the moment, and, we think, consciously, but after the first burst of his devotion, after the deep contemplation into which he was plunged, had given place to feel the necessity of acting in one way or another. We are led to believe, and have already expressed that belief, that his natural ambition rose, and that all his thoughts were turned upon the surest method of accomplishing some great and uncommon exploit, by which he may render himself famous. As devotion was the principal requisite for success in the path which he had chosen, Ignatius was a fervent devotee, first by calculation, and then by habit, but not the less zealous for all that. Had his whole thoughts been absorbed with that one object, the salvation of his soul, his devotion would have been less ostentatious, and, without wavering between one project and another, he would have been contented with a humble and retired life, or would have spent it in unquestionable works of charity, in ministering to the sick, as he had begun in the hospital of the Theatines. It could not be denied, however, that Ignatius, after his conversion was very humane, compassionate, and charitable, and that his private conduct in the latter part of his life was moral and unimpeached. He treated his disciples with much kindness and never denied them what he could grant them without inconvenience. On the other hand, he was imperious to the last degree and could not endure the slightest contradiction. An old Jesuit priest who had been guilty of disobedience was scourged in his own presence. One instance will perhaps serve to depict Loyola's more effectively than words can. He had sent Lyon as a provincial to Padua, Lyon who had an immense success at the Council of Trent, and who was in fact superior to any one then belonging to the society, at first refused this secondary post, but at last obeyed. Hardly had he, however, entered upon his functions, before Ignatius drained his province of all the best professors, whom he summoned to Rome. The provincial remonstrated. It was the Lyon, Ignatius, bosom friend, his right hand, the glory of the company, the man who had been chosen to be a cardinal. But Ignatius disregarded all these considerations, and without even entering into discussion, simply wrote to him thus: "Reflect on your proceedings. Tell me if you are persuaded of having erred, and if so, indicate to me what punishment you are ready to undergo for the expiation of your fault." This letter portrays the man. We are also assured that the general was so humble that you might have seen him carrying wood on his shoulders, lighting the common fire, or going to the well with a pitcher in his hand. We should be inclined to call such humility ostentatious, or, if you prefer it, good policy. Ignatius was, above all, anxious to curb the spirit of his disciples. In his eyes, they could not be humble and submissive enough. The Jesuit ought to value himself individually as nothing, the society as everything. Now, which of his disciples would have dared refuse any undertaking, however humble, after he had seen his general engaged in the meanest services? But while Ignatius effected these acts of humanity, he was seriously giving his attention to the state of affairs of different nations. He was holding correspondence with John III of Portugal, the Cardinal his son, Albert of Bavaria, Ferdinand of Austria, Philip of Spain, Ercole of Este, and many other princes. He was the spiritual director of Margaret of Austria. He went to Tivoli purposely to ally the quarrels of two neighboring towns, and to Naples to make peace between an angry husband and his wife of rather doubtful morals. All these things tend to prove what we have said regarding his devotion, viz., that it was of a rather meddlesome and ambitious character. But his career was now drawing to an end. These different occupations, the direction of both the spiritual and temporal matters of the order, which was already widely spread, the anxiety caused by the many conflicts in which the society was engaged, the fear of defeat, the joy arising from success, the unrelenting activity, the uneasing at seeing the chair occupied by Carafa, always adverse to the order, all these things contributed to shorten his days. His constitution, which had been impaired in his youth and in the cavern of Manresa, now gradually gave way, and although no symptom of his approaching end was yet visible, no paleness of countenance, not a sign in all his body, nevertheless he felt the vital principle fading away within him, and that his last hour was rapidly drawing near. He tried the country air, and for this purpose went to a villa, lately given by some friends for the use of the Roman college, but he found no relief. His strength was fast failing him. An unconquerable lassitude crept over his whole frame, and his intellect only remained clear and unchanged. He spoke of his illness, nay, of his approaching end to nobody. He returned to Rome and threw himself upon a bed. A doctor was sent forth by the alarmed fathers, but he bade them Be of good cheer, for there was nothing the matter with the general. Ignatius smiled, and when the physician was gone, he gave orders to his secretary, Polankus, to proceed to the Holy Father straightway to recommend the society to his care, and to obtain a blessing from himself, Ignatius, and indulgences for his sins. Perhaps he made this last attempt to disarm, by his humility, the inflexible Paul IV, Caratha, and so render him favorable to the society. He was mistaken. Paul sent the requested benison, but he did not change his mind towards the society. However, Polankus, reassured by the doctor, and not seeing any danger himself, disregarded the order, postponing the fulfillment of his mission till the next day. Meanwhile, after Ignatius had attended till very late to some affairs concerning the Roman college, he was left alone to rest. But what was the surprise and consternation of the fathers on entering his room next morning to find him breathing his last! The noise and confusion caused by such an unexpected event was great. Cordials, doctor, confessor were immediately sent for, but before any of them came, before Polankus, who only now ran to the Pope, returned, Loyola had expired. His demise took place at 5 o'clock on the morning of the 31st of July, 1556, in his 65th year. So ended a man who was extolled by the one party as a saint, execrated by the other as a monster. He was neither, most assuredly, in the Protestant point of view, and by all those who advocate the cause of freedom of conscience, and of a return to the purity of the primitive religion of Christ. Ignatius ought to be detested above any other individual. To him and to his order belongs the mournful glory of having checked the progress of the Reformation, and of having kept a great part of Europe under the yoke of superstition and tyranny. And here we are led to mention a fact which we think has hitherto been unnoticed: the indulgence, we should say, the partiality evinced by Protestant writers for these last 10 years towards the Jesuits, and especially the founders of the order. The fact must be explained. The Jesuits from 1830 to the end of 1840 seem to have lost all public favor, all influence and authority. Persecuted and hooted in France, Switzerland, Russia, hated in their own dominion, Italy, they were considered as a vanquished enemy, deserving rather commiseration than hatred. A reaction ensued in their favor among their most decided opponents. Generous souls rose up to defend these persecuted men, and stretched out a friendly hand to them. Thus trodden upon by all, carried away with such chivalrous sentiments, they have embellished with the colors of their fervid imaginations and the graces of their copious style whatever the Jesuit writers have related of their chiefs, and have represented Loyola and his companions as heroes of romance, rather than real historical characters. We leave these writers to reflect whether the Jesuits are a vanquished enemy, or whether they are not still redoubtful and menacing foes. But, with deference to such distinguished writers as Macaulay, Taylor, Stephen, and others, we dare to assert that in writing about the Jesuits they are led astray by the above romantic sentiments, and we should moreover warn them that their words are quoted by the Jesuit writers Cretinito, Pellico as irrefragable testimony of the sanctity of their members. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.